And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again, and today is going to be quite a long video and kind of unrelated to previous ones that I've been doing recently. This isn't a reading guide and it's not so much a random thought. This is kind of an observation about something that's been happening in comics for a while. I'm specifically going to use some DC Comics examples because I had them handy. And this is a video that I've been planning on making for quite some time. In fact, I had the notes and the script for this sitting around for, I've got to be honest, maybe about a year and a half or longer. And this is another one of those videos which I've been meaning to make for ages, and I wanted to do it really well, and that's kind of crippled me from actually doing it at all. And so, as I said a month or so ago, I'm just going to start knocking these videos out, whether or not they're perfect, whether or not they're polished. So on that note, today's video is going to be told specifically through the vehicle of Superman. And in particular, this is something that came up when I was actually doing the research for my Superman reading guide for the entire published Superman era from 1991, so the start of the Man of Steel series in 1991, all the way up to 2011. And for those of you that are familiar with this guide, and it does appear to be selling reasonably well on Amazon, what this guide is to every single issue of mainline Superman comics. So that's Action Comics, Superman, Adventures of Superman, Man of Tomorrow, Man of Steel, random kind of one-shots and events all the way through up until 2011 and Flashpoint. And whilst this guide is available on Kindle, and it's basically a pretty intimidating block of text of just how to read stuff, and there's a series of YouTube videos on this as well on my channel, one of the things that I made notes on whilst I was doing this was something that kind of happened incidentally, which is I started noticing a lot of woke stuff in these comics. And the thumbnail I'm making for this video is probably going to be kind of deliberately clickbaity, because I know that when it comes to comics and what people refer to as woke behavior, there's the whole go woke, go broke, and there are hundreds of comic channels that are based entirely upon daily or at least bi-weekly content, ripping on comics, ripping on Marvel, ripping on DC, complaining that they're too woke, complaining about politics in comics and so on and so forth. And that's literally their entire USP. That's the only thing they do. They whinge constantly negatively about it. I don't do that on this channel. And despite the clickbait thumbnail, I'm not really going to offer much opinion here on what I'm about to talk about. What I will say as a preface, completely candidly and honestly, is I like politics in my comics. All comics are political. Superman doing super heroic stuff is political. Batman is political, as is Wonder Woman, as are the X-Men. All comics are, to one extent or another, the imposition of an individual or group ideology upon the world around them. It's political, no matter how you try to paint it. I don't view that as a bad thing, but of course, we live in the era of the outrage economy and clickbait monetization on the internet. As you can tell by this very long, tedious and monotone intro, that's not the sort of thing that I care about. I don't care about that sort of monetization, that sort of desperation for clicks and subscribers. If you want that sort of channel, don't come here. This isn't the sort of channel for it. But I am aware of the discourse on go woke, go broke, or this sucks or that sucks, or all that sort of identity politics. And what I noticed is it's been happening for a very long time. Not just the discourse, but the introduction of woke identity politic comics in comics. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk through some events that have happened just looking at the mainline Superman comics that I was reading. And we're going to start in 1991, and I'm going to talk you through it. And as I talk you through it, I'm going to point out how I think those things would have landed had they been published in 2026. And that's not necessarily to say that they shouldn't have been published in 1991, and that's not even to say they shouldn't be published now. It's to kind of highlight a very simple point, which is that people who are complaining, bitching and whinging nowadays that comics have become really political and woke, those people are not comic fans. Because if they were, they would have read stuff like the examples I'm about to talk about. So, with no further ado, let's dive into it. When I was making my Superman reading order, I started off in 1991 with Man of Steel issue 1, and very soon I came across this. This is The Adventures of Superman issue 481. It came out in August 1991, so way back in the day. And in this, you have the introduction of this character, Ron. Now, Ron is a black guy. As you can see, he tries to get a job at the Daily Planet, or at, as you can see, part of the Newstime organization. And he essentially ends up getting the job just by kind of barging an interview, and he gets the job over Jimmy Olsen. Not a big deal, but it's important to note that this is a couple of pages just about Ron getting his job, about a black guy getting a job at a news organization. Totally fine, no beef. Okay, but let's keep that in mind. Next up, we have literally the next issue, which is The Adventures of Superman 482, came out the next month in September 91. And you'll notice here, there's quite a lot of talk about picket lines and unions and strike action. Weird for a comic, but absolutely relevant for the times. I mean, this is the 90s. I don't know what it was like over in the States, but in the UK, we just got out of Thatcher's Britain. It was pretty grim. All we had to eat was barbed wire. All we had to sleep on was broken glass. It was pretty grim. Unions, picket lines, recession, we were all dealing with it, and it was part of a Superman comic where they talked about it. Moving on to the next month, in October 91, you've got Action Comics 670. As you'll notice from the tagline, this is part of the Armageddon 1991 event. But again, in this, you've got more talk about unions, unionization and strikes and picket lines and scabs, all in front of the Daily Planet. It's weird to think about this because I guess if this was published now, you'd have so many people on YouTube going, oh my God, woke, liberal, communists and socialists all over the place. Back in 1991, people were like, yeah, this is part of the discourse. Moving on to Action Comics Adventures of Superman 490. This is May 1992. And this issue, as you can see here, has got a conversation about positive action. This is between Ron, who we saw about a year ago, I guess, but in that issue a bit ago. He's been a regular Superman character since, and this is him talking to his sister, who admittedly looks kind of intense, but it's talking about positive action, positive discrimination, and the use of tokenism by major organisations like Newstime or things like that to simply pretend that they're quota filling, box ticking. We all know the terms, we all know the concept. But the truth is, this was in a Superman comic, and it merited a couple of pages on it. It was relevant for the time. This is the early 90s. This is the era of Rodney King, remember? And it was just something that was important to a comic like Superman, which is about tackling injustice. But you got to wonder, what would have happened had that been published today? Moving on to Action Comics, and this is issue 677. Came out in, again, the same month. And there's a conversation there about representation. About representation of African Americans, so black people, at the Daily Planet or at news organisations. Again, this is relevant for the time. This is completely apposite. This is completely in keeping with the conversation that had been building up for several years in Superman. It's a reflection of the era. No one picketed. There wasn't a YouTube at the time, but there was no clickbait. There was no controversy. It was just, this is part of the rich tapestry of the Superman story. Let's pause on the race stuff for a second. Next, we've got a double header. We've actually got Man of Steel 16 and Superman 72, which came out in September of that year, so 1992. This is a two-parter called Crisis at Hand. And I'll be honest, this is a great story, but a very depressing story. It's a story about domestic violence. And specifically, it's a story about domestic violence happening in the same building Clark Kent lives in. Obviously, he's Superman, so he can hear it. He knows what's going on. He tries to intervene. And when he does, what happens? The victim, the woman being assaulted by her husband, calls the police, tries to protect her husband, wants to press charges against Superman. So what does Superman do? Well, he's been rejected as the superhero, so as Clark Kent, he goes to the police and tries to report it. And the police can't do anything because he's not the person being affected or being assaulted. And again, as we move into the second issue, he's powerless. What can he do? How can he deal with it? If you've got someone who doesn't want to be helped, and in fact who fights and rejects the help at hand, what is he supposed to do with all his superpowers? I think this is a great, really, really interesting double-header issue. The issue of domestic violence and domestic assault isn't really dealt with very well in comics, or in fact at all in most media. And that's because it is really fucking grim and depressing. I've worked in domestic violence, and the horrible truth isn't just the idea of domestic violence happening and the fact that most people have been assaulted 15 or 20 times before they first seek help. No, the horrible thing is what people in domestic violence work, caseworkers and support workers, which I used to be one of them, what referred to as boomerang clients. You have people that leave their partner just for a night and then go back the next day. And sometimes it's because there are kids or pets or things like that involved, but often it's because they just can't see how bad the situation is. You can't help people who aren't ready to be helped. It doesn't matter what superpowers you have. It doesn't matter what you want to do or what's right or what's wrong. It's a really painful, really jarring issue to read because it highlights the truth, which is that actually superheroes show a binary world where you can punch or laser beam your way out of any situation. The real world isn't like that. And in this context, Superman is powerless. Identity politics? Yeah, maybe. Woke? Yeah, maybe. But true and really good writing. What we have next is a bunch of comics from December 1993, and this is what is called the Spilled Blood arc. So it's Adventures of Superman 507, Action Comics 694. Essentially, long story short, it's about a white supremacist called Bloodsport. And as you can see from the images here, it's pretty racist. I mean, the comic itself isn't racist, but the antagonist, Bloodsport, is. I mean, to start with, he refers to all African Americans as boy, which is a racist macro-aggression, I guess. If you're not sure why that is, then you should Google it and educate yourself a little bit. But in addition to that, it's just got a lot of stuff about him talking about your kind or their kind and race traitors. And as you can see here, pretty hardcore Nazi-esque iconography. Lots of broad racial, racist cliches and stereotypes come out of this guy's mouth, talking about black people being on welfare or how much he likes to kill black people, or like, you know, a lot of sort of toxic stuff like that. There's a scene where he sees a couple that's a mixed race couple, and as a result, he actually kills them both because he views a white woman who's in that sort of relationship as being a kind of race traitor. Pretty grim stuff. Pretty grim. Pretty dark. And the second issue only kind of continues that. Again, it goes on about him talking about people, black people being their kind as being othered, talking about whites and blacks. It even skirts around almost using racial epithets and pretty incendiary kind of language. Speaking of which, in July the next year, we actually had the Elseworlds DC annual event. Now, if you're interested in what that is, I've got a separate set of videos on this channel which are specifically about the DC annual events, so the Elseworlds event, the Dead Earth event, all that sort of stuff. And those events kind of happened once a year. They only cover the annual issues in any particular series, and in this case we're looking at Steel Annual 1, so the series is called Steel. And this entire issue, being an Elseworlds one, isn't just Elseworlds in the contemporary day, it's actually an Elseworlds issue which is kind of like a historic story. It goes back to the era of slavery and plantations in American history, and essentially the premise is that John Irons, or the main character of Steel, is born then to a slave, and it's about him interacting with his white masters and so on. So you'll see a lot of pretty deplorable language here, a lot of pretty deplorable things. Interestingly, this is the only time I can recall, at least during this era, DC Comics using literally the N-word in print, fully unedited, unblocked out, unbleeped, unredacted. It's bold. It's a bold use of language, and one does wonder what would happen if they tried to do that now in 2026. I think in this context, and I say this as someone who's not white, I think it's entirely justifiable because it's about realism, it's about accuracy, it's about pointing out how evocatively damaged this entire era is from a social fabric sort of way. But the issue is dark. John Irons gets whipped almost to death by his slave masters. At one point they're talking, well, he has a son, and then they're talking about selling his son and the bids they're getting on it because John Henry's so big and muscular and that sort of thing. This is true. This is exactly the sort of thing that happened. In fact, this is a really sanitized, nice, Disney-fied version of the truth about slavery. So whilst this is dark and pretty hardcore, it's an important and necessary story. Can you imagine all the YouTube channels that I'm talking about? Can you imagine how they would have reacted had this been published recently, during Black Lives Matter or any time after that. Anyway, moving on from 1994 and the summer of 1994, later that year we saw Action Comics 702, which was the return of Bloodsport. And as you can see here, he carries on just like spouting his random racist vitriol about how whites are better than blacks and things like that. It's pretty grim. It's pretty racist. But they don't pull any punches. Like, the things he says are just outright the sort of things a bad guy would say, the sort of things a racist would say. Talking about how brilliant, like, sort of German practices during World War II was, and how proud he is that he sort of, killed white people who were fraternizing with black people, and how it's a shame that white neighborhoods are X, Y, or Z. Interestingly, right at the end of it, there's this little scene here where Clark Kent is speaking to Ron. Remember Ron? And there's a bit where Clark Kent's kind of like, amen to that, brother, which admittedly is him appropriating ebonics. If you don't know what ebonics is, go on Wikipedia. But my point is, at the time, this wasn't a very controversial thing for him to have said. It was just kind of like in keeping with essentially the increasing integration of African American culture and the African American diaspora into the American mainstream. What I remember is maybe 10 years ago, one of the Ultimates annuals back in Ultimate Marvel before the Secret Wars event, it had this scene, which is one where the Falcon, I think this is Sam Wilson saying this, uses the phrase true dat, which obviously is kind of part of African American vernacular. And it highlights here in this panel that Captain America is really not kind of understanding of what this is, not familiar with it. And I don't know, the Superman one kind of reminded me of the Ultimates one. Although, again, in the case of the Ultimates, they're playing it safe, because what you have is the black person speaking with African American vernacular and the white person not. And I do wonder, if they tried to flip that the other way around, how would that have landed in a more recent climate? Moving on to Superman issue 41. This is actually the Man of Steel issue 41, sorry. And this came out in February 1995. And what we have here is a whole subplot that starts to develop about interracial adoption. Perry White, yeah, I know, unfortunate surname, that's what it always was. Ironically, Perry White is the one who's going to be adopting a black kid. And they have several pages talking about the politics of white families adopting African American youths. Is it white saviorship? Is it just race politics? Is it good for the kid? What does the research say? Moving on to Man of Steel issue 44, which came out in May 95. Again, there's a lot of talk here about racial profiling, because this is the kid that they've adopted and he gets racially profiled as a shoplifter. But more to the point, Perry then has a conversation with him about, like, what's it like being a black kid in a white family. And then when the kid goes home and the storyline develops, what you've got there is Perry's wife talking to someone on the phone about the pros and cons of transracial adoption and trying to defend it. By the way, if you're wondering how all this relates to Superman, keep in mind these issues were in Superman comics. This was just kind of like peppered throughout it, because this is necessary to being realistic. Wow, this video is going long. I didn't mean to go this long, but let's move on to the Man of Steel, issue 47. This came out in August 95. The whole thing is largely a flashback episode about Perry White and some other dude whose name I forget, fighting the KKK back in the day. And it's them just having a big flashback episode about how bad the KKK were. Can you imagine doing issues about the KKK now? I know Superman Smashes the Klan came out a couple of years ago, and that was actually based on something which was historically accurate. And even then, there was controversy, there was headlines, there was YouTube clickbait about it. As if it's all new. It's not all new. I'm showing you stuff that happened in the 90s. Let's pause on the race stuff for a while. Let's dive into a little mini-series that came around about this time. So from late 1994 to early 1995, you had the Metropolis SCU, or Special Crimes Unit mini-series. And in this mini-series, it's not very good, to be honest. The storyline's a bit meh. But the point that I want to make is that it's got Maggie Sawyer in it. And Maggie Sawyer, for those that don't know, is a sort of very obviously out lesbian police captain. And it's got her and her partner. And it's got sort of a lot of relationship trouble between them, but largely because Maggie's ex-husband is an absolute nightmare to deal with, and to try to handle all, being a mother, being a police commissioner, her relationship with her girlfriend, etc., etc. Anyway, it's all in this. It's fine. I mean, the series itself wasn't especially good, generally speaking, but the reason that I didn't like it wasn't because of the lesbian relationship. That had nothing to do with anything. It's just the way Maggie Sawyer is. And obviously in the various New 52 and so on, all the various reboots since then, Maggie comes back in as a major character and a love interest for Batwoman. No one had massive issues with the relationship or a sexual orientation then. What would it be like now? We're thinking about. Moving back into the mainstream, you've got Adventures of Superman issue 526. So this is the return of Bloodsport. Specifically, he's in prison and he's essentially, as a white supremacist, fighting a black guy. Black guy was also called Bloodsport as his evil supervillain name. So it's Bloodsport versus Bloodsport. And again, you've got the white Bloodsport talking about sort of Nazi iconography, about to use racial slurs, and so on and so forth. Talk about sending black people back to Africa. I mean, yeah, that's exactly how a racist would talk. But would that actually get published today? I would be amazed. Moving on to issue 117 of Superman. This is actually part of the Final Night event. Interesting stuff here, but largely because it talks about how the media is essentially been forced to degenerate into clickbait more than anything else. And so there's kind of like old school media who do it by morals and principles versus new clickbait media who just kind of care about engagement. Obviously, this is pre-internet, so this is all about just getting hate mail, getting people to buy it, getting people to argue. And actually, again, one of the things that comes up is interracial adoption as one of the polarizing themes. Moving on to the end of 1996, you've got Superman's wedding album. So here it's got this distinctive cover, but in the actual issue itself, it's got some interesting stuff about how Ron, being black, is dating a white woman and how the tensions sort of arise around that. Now, the interesting thing about this, which I think I haven't mentioned so far, is Ron ends up dating Lois Lane's sister, Lucy. So Ron and Lucy together. Lucy looks like this, so she's white, blonde, hot, and her dad is obviously a general in the American Army. And what they talk about is about whether or not, fundamentally, whether or not her dad's racist. What issue he might have with this interracial relationship. And again, this is in as high profile an issue as the Superman wedding album. In the next year, and the reason I'm giving the years will become evident towards the end of this video when you see how rapidly the drop-off is in this kind of woke representation. But sorry, the next issue is Superman 121 from March 1997. This entire issue is just fantastic. It's called, rather the story is called, they call it Suicide Slum. It's by Dan Jurgens and it is just brilliant. It's an entire issue about how there's loads of crime happening in Suicide Slum in Metropolis and Superman never goes because frankly it's a black neighborhood, Superman's white, and he just ends up fucking ignoring it without realizing. And it's one of those issues where Clark Kent has a momentary epiphany and he tries to get involved, tries to help things, and then realizes the situation is far too complex and is far too socially nuanced for him to really get involved in. And yeah, ends up just being powerless again. How would that track in the modern day to all those kind of crazy, super negative comic YouTube sites? I don't know. Action Comics 740 was published at the end of 1997 and it's got a couple of interesting scenes about interracial dating. Specifically, is Ron talking to his sister, who no longer has the crazy hair, as you can see here, and is basically talking about how, you know, how difficult interracial dating can be. It's about to get much more difficult, as we're about to see in a second, as we look at Man of Steel issue 77. This came out in March 1998, and you can see again it's talking a lot about segregation, things about coloured drinking fountains and sort of the difficulty there is, again, in interracial relationships and so on. The next issue, which is Action Comics 743, again talks a lot about interracial dating and the trouble that Ron's having with it, which, again, as someone who's not white, I can entirely empathise with. I wasn't dating back in the 90s, but, you know, I can still empathise with it now by a massive margin. Massive plot twist. In Man of Steel number 83, Lucy finds out she's pregnant and needs to start thinking about an abortion. An abortion. That's what we're talking about now in a Superman comic. And at the time, this was, I'm not going to say it was fine. Obviously, it would have been quite controversial at the time. But these are the topics that Superman's been talking about for almost 30 years. That abortion theme carries on in Man of Tomorrow 11, where Ron finds out that Lucy's pregnant and the conversation has to be had about, do we keep the baby, do we not? I was about to get an abortion. Pretty intense stuff. What then happens in Action Comics 750, which came out in early 1999, Lucy and Ron tell Ron's parents about the baby. And they're super cool about it, which is actually really nice. And I'm not sure that's actually a very realistic depiction of what would happen. I think the next issue, which is Man of Tomorrow 12, where they tell Lucy's parents about it, is much more realistic. Because her dad hits the fucking roof. Again, remember, this is in Superman comics. Again, let's pause on the race stuff for a while. We're looking at Man of Steel number 87, which came out in March 99. Superman starts talking about climate change and why it's a bad thing and why he needs to tackle it. All right, that was enough. Let's dive back into the racism stuff. So, Action Comics 753, Ron's sister points out that Lucy doesn't walk through black neighborhoods. Painful, but true. Adventures of Superman 574, which came out in January 2000, Lucy's parents literally expressed the concern about how black the baby will be, what the baby will look like. That's kind of mental. And when I was reading it a couple of years ago, it reminded me very much of the interview that Meghan Markle did with, Meghan Sussex. My apologies. Meghan Sussex did with Oprah Winfrey, where she was talking about all the various problems with the royal family, understanding that she was going to be married to Prince Harry and so on and so forth. And as we know, huge amount of controversy about that. And as we know, it's really fucking rude and really fucking intolerant and really just unacceptable to be caring about the colour of a baby. Whether that's because one parent's white, one parent's black, or whether that's because you've got different sort of, in my experience, South Asian ethnicities. And even within South Asian culture, there's a lot of conversation and stigma about skin colour and darkness of skin colour. All these things are not only taboo, all these things are deeply culturally inappropriate and deeply intolerant. And that's in the modern day. But this is back then. This is back during Superman in Adventures 574, when they're talking about it quite openly. And it's obviously a really controversial, really tense conversation. But it's fascinating and, to be honest, like, kind of cool that they talked about it. All right, let's dive out for a second. This really cool cover is actually from Man of Steel 103. I know it says Superman and Supergirl, but it's just Man of Steel. And in this, Superman's basically talking about climate change again. And he's there talking about Aquaman. It's slightly annoying they only had these kind of one-off issues about climate change, but it's him talking a lot about climate change, whether or not it's their right or whether it's their responsibility to intervene. It's a really interesting issue. Speaking of interesting issues, in Superman 178, which came out in March 2002, by the way, keep in mind now there's been a 2-year jump. We're going to start seeing this more and more often. The amount of political or quote-unquote woke stuff in Superman is about to tail off really dramatically. But in this issue, which came out in March 2002, you got Superman debating whether or not he really should still be using the tagline about truth, justice, the American way. I know that tagline. I love that tagline. I grew up with that tagline. But he's not wrong. Is it really the American way anymore? I'm filming this in March 2026. I'm not sure America's doing okay, to be honest. So far this year, America has invaded and stolen Venezuela, threatened to invade Greenland, who was an ally, had a lot of hoo-ha about the Trump-Epstein files, which is still ongoing. And in a bid to distract from that, they've triggered a civil war in Minnesota, and they're currently starting World War III in the Middle East. I say World War III, obviously we moved on to non-numbered episodic seasons of World Wars, I think. And so the current installment is the Iran DLC. But my point is Superman really something that should be tied to just the American values? And I'm not alone in this. I remember a few years ago, there was a lot of controversy when Superman changed his motto to truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. Controversy to the extent it actually got reported on in magazines like Rolling Stones and Variety, which is just wild when you think about it. I prefer this tagline. It's not the classic one. It's not the one I grew up with. It's not the one I'm familiar with. But things change. And again, what I want to point out is whilst this happened in 2021, there were YouTube channels kicking off left, right and centre. Oh, it's go woke, go broke. Oh my God, it's the DEI agenda. Oh my God, it's the woke mind virus and it's a conspiracy. And yeah, I mean, it could be a conspiracy. It'd have to be a really complicated, really expensive conspiracy because they would have had to develop a time machine to send this idea back 19 years prior to the article I'm showing you now. They'd have to send this idea back 19 years to 2002 and put it in a comic then and have no one really care about it. Again, we live in the era of outrage and manufactured anger. This idea that wokeness is a new thing is just so deranged and so completely lacking in historical context that, yeah, it's hard to know what to say. Let's move on, and we're going to dive back into the race thing, but this is an issue that I absolutely love. It's fantastic from start to finish. It's a little bit like the Suicide Slum issue, but essentially what happens is Superman goes to an area of Metropolis which actually has its own black superhero, a guy called Muhammad X, who he has never seen before, this guy here. And basically Muhammad X is like, what the fuck are you doing here? No one wants you here. You never come here normally. Just go fuck off. And Superman, being Superman, takes it a little bit, sensitively, because he is actually quite thin-skinned whenever these things come up. And it leads to a really, really interesting issue, including like some quite interesting scenes where he's speaking to Lois and he's like, actually, like other superheroes, like, they look up to him, but then do they have any black role models to look up to? Now, the idea of role models is one I don't necessarily agree with. I think the idea of role models is a bit of a straw man argument and can be pulled apart quite a lot. But the point is true, and he brings it up with Martian Manhunter. He's like, how come there aren't any black people in the Justice League? And Martian Manhunter's like, well, you can talk to Steel about it. He's like, what? Ask my one token black friend. He doesn't speak for all black people. It's really interesting. And Muhammad X is a really interesting character, and I think it's ridiculous that he wasn't used subsequently. If I ever got offered a job by DC, I would turn down Batman to write a limited series about Muhammad X. I tell you that right now. Sticking on the race issue, the last issue of Man of Steel was issue 134. A variety of things happen in it, but the final page is this one, which is Superman talking to Natasha Irons, so John Henry's daughter, in this scene while he's kind of helping her out of some rubble. I don't have a problem with it in context, but we're not talking about context. We're talking about how this would be treated if this particular issue, and keep in mind this particular issue was published in March 2003. If this had been published today, the accusations of white saviorship and mansplaining, and to be honest, Superman's like little speech he does in the preceding couple of pages and on this page are a bit patronizing, but come on, he's Superman. He can be a bit preachy. He tends to go into speech mode. But this image itself, even I turned the page and I kind of winced and I was like, oh, the optics on this are not great, both from a gender or a race point of view. It's like, it looks a little bit sketch, but it's not as if there were people writing. It's not as if people were burning their comic book collections or doing the ridiculously contrived things you see in the comic manosphere. It was just an image that was there in 2003. Speaking of Natasha, some interesting stuff with her. So what we see is in Action Comics 806 and 807, that came out in late 2003, Natasha kind of takes over the mantle of being Steel, which is fine. So she's the first black kind of superhero with like by superhero, I mean member of the super family with the S on her chest, which is cool. But interestingly, something that comes up in this repeatedly is the idea of ebonics, and that especially comes in Action Comics 808, where the character Tracy 13 points out Natasha doesn't actually sound black. Now, there's a lot to be said about this, about African American vernacular. We've already touched on that a bit. There's a lot to be said about ebonics and how that works, and there's a lot to be said about how specific diction and speech patterns are inherited by second-generation immigrants. I'm one of them. If you are in Britain, and if you speak English, obviously, and if you listen to me carefully, it's evident that I don't speak English as an indigenous English language speaker. In fact, it was the 5th language I learned when I was 6 years old. It's not my first language. And the cadence and my language and my high and low register vocabulary kind of underlines that. So there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had about the fact that Natasha doesn't, quote unquote, sound black. And then also the fact that she essentially programs Kelex to speak in this kind of ridiculous 70s blaxploitation vernacular, which she subsequently regrets as well, but frankly is pretty fucking funny. So all that was in December 2003, and interesting stuff. I mean, again, if that had been published today, riots, people pouring lighter fluid on their comics and setting it on fire, and very dramatic YouTube videos, losing the absolute mind talking about it, but it's not happening now. People aren't printing it now. That issue was from December 2003. Between that and the final issue we're going to talk about today was an 8-year gap. So between the discussion about vernacular and ebonics in Action Comics 808, the next time what I would refer to as a woke or an identity politics issue came up was in Action Comics 900, which was published in 2011. And this massive issue is a series of vignettes, and one of the vignettes is called The Incident. And the setting of the incident is actually during the real-life 2011 protests happening in Iran. I know, the irony, given what's happening currently in the world. It's one of the reasons I wanted to make the video today. I thought I just need to get this fucking thing off my to-do list. Now, interestingly, the incident, being about Iran and being published in 2011, did spark interest upon release. Various news outlets reported on it. So what you'll see here, and these are just a couple of screen grabs, is you've got the New York Times, their Arts Beat column, reported on it because Superman renounces his US citizenship in that storyline. Newsarama, I know, not exactly a brilliant source, but they reported on it. The Comics Alliance reported on it. So whereas the previous things I've been talking about, I've been interjecting by going, oh, this reminds me of something that happened in Marvel Ultimates, or this reminds me of something that Megan Sussex said on an Oprah Winfrey interview recently, or this sparked outrage in terms of the change of the Superman tagline in 2021. That's me just pointing out things that have happened now, which kind of recontextualize what was being done then. But this issue is the first time that something that was, for want of a better term, woke, led to kind of global headlines. Not necessarily outrage, but we're now moving into that direction. And after that, then we get into the New 52 and DC Rebirth and, well, the era of YouTube outrage. Constant YouTube outrage. This final image here is from the, I think it's the post-DC Rebirth era. So we're looking at kind of Infinite Frontier. I haven't read much Infinite Frontier at all. But from what I gather, when Tom Taylor took over one of the Superman lines, he made John Kent, so Clark Kent's son, gay or bisexual or something. He had a boyfriend. I thought this was a fucking terrible idea. And the reason I thought that was because I thought aging up John Kent was just lazy-ass behaviour by Brian Michael Bendis during the Rebirth era. And when I get to that bit of my Rebirth reading order in the next few weeks, you'll hear me just go on a big rant about why that's just lazy writing. That's my issue with John Kent being gay or dating anyone, is that he's supposed to be 7 years old. He should have stayed there. That was a really cool dynamic. Just having him as another teen superhero, Christ, we've got too many of them. But that's not how the internet saw it. The internet saw it as, oh my God, he's gay, it's terrible, it's an erosion of something, the male psyche, masculinity, whatever it is. Anyway, listen, I just wanted to kind of chronicle this in case you were interested. But I guess the point is this. This idea that comics are becoming woke and therefore they're going to go broke, or this idea that there's a DEI agenda shoveling these things into comics, is literally, objectively, and factually not true. All I've done is look at Superman comics, and I've already found something like 40 examples since 1990 of pretty intense things, talking about abortions in interracial unmarried relationships, all that sort of stuff. I mean, this is not easy reading. This is not light superhero related, whiz bang kapow stuff. This is intense social commentary on political issues, and it was part of the DNA of these comics. I could do the same thing with any comic line you want to mention, from X-Men to Batman to Flash to Captain America. I could easily do all this and find these really, really clear, obvious political points being made back in comics in the 90s, all the way up to the current day. But only the current day sparks outrage. At a time when only in the current day can you get a career from being outraged. I'm not outraged by any of this. I like politics in my comics. I like the fact that these comics explore these things. I especially like politics with a big P. So this sort of stuff about Superman renouncing his US citizenship and things like that, I found that really interesting. The domestic violence stuff I found really interesting. Politics in a real world sense is fascinating, is why I wrote my books, the No God Your King series. At least the first 4 of them. The 5th one gets really, really political. And when that publishes in a few months, you'll see what I mean. But my point is that that's always been there. And if you don't like it, cool. Absolutely cool. Then you don't have to read the comics. And if you do like it, then great. Because it's in comics now too. What you can't do is you can't act like it's never been there and it's only there now, because that is wrong. And also on the other side of the fence, you can't act like all the stuff about woke identity, DEI stuff in comics now is all brilliant. It's not. Some of it is garbage and performative and token and really fucking annoying. Don't even get me started with Ms. Marvel. That's really annoying. But my point is, this childish knee-jerk reactionary stuff you see in some YouTube videos, not true. And if you're interested in that, and if you're interested in kind of like having that dialogue with people about that, hopefully this video has provided you a whole bunch of examples on that. I don't really have anything else to add. Please behave yourself in the comments section. And yeah, this is just something I wanted to get off my chest. I know it's a really long video. Thank you very much for sticking till the very end. Hopefully you kind of watched this as well as listened to it as a podcast, because there was stuff on the screen that was kind of important. But yeah, in other news, we're going to carry on with the weekly drops and carry on moving through DC New 52 and DC Rebirth stuff. There's new stuff coming in. I'm going to try and keep it going along. Sorry I missed the last week's upload. I was away basically with work. But as always, thanks very much for watching. Stay classy, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.